Welcome to this episode of the Sports Detective Podcast Show. My name is James Williams, and today we are going to be talking about USC Trojans football, and I am joined by Mark Kolkin, who is the host of the Locked On USC podcast. And Mark, I just want to start out here. This is a new kind of situation for the USC Trojans, where they are going to be joining the Big Ten this year. What do you think are reasonable expectations for USC heading into the Big Ten year one?
Expectations. The bar should be, if you're a Trojan fan, it should be 8 wins. And that's the low bar. It's difficult. There's no doubting that. They open up against LSU in Las Vegas in 8 days. The season is in Ann Arbor against Michigan. Before they get to the second half of the season, they're going to be playing Penn State and Wisconsin as well. But those games are in LA. Like I said, the low bar is 8 games. I don't think anybody picks or anticipates USC going undefeated this season. I think 10-2 is where everybody should be landing. I think that's the sweet spot. At least that's my sweet spot where I'm going. I'm not ready to predict where those losses are coming. But again, you've got LSU, you've got Michigan, you've got Notre Dame at the end of the year, you've got the other rivalry game with UCLA at the end of the year. And before you get there, you still have Penn State, Wisconsin, and Washington season.
Yeah, the USC Trojans right now have the third toughest schedule in the preseason. That's mostly because they have 2 very tough out-of-conference games with LSU and Notre Dame, kind of back-ending and front-ending the season for you guys. And then you guys really didn't catch too many breaks in the Big Ten. Now, you don't play Ohio State or Oregon, but you do have to play Penn State. You do have to play Michigan. And then all of the other Big Ten teams that you guys got, they are solid teams. You don't really have any sort of cupcakes on your guys' schedule. So I do think 8-4 is a fair, look ahead for you guys. And I think 10-2 would be a very, very good season for you guys, just looking at the tough schedule that you guys have ahead. But the thing I'm kind of curious about with this USC team, because this is a team that I think a lot of people are down on, and I think a lot of people aren't necessarily thinking that USC is going to have that high of a season right now. The over-under win total is 7.5. And I want to talk about kind of both sides of the ball here with USC, because I think both sides of the ball are going to be a lot different than they were last year, or even the year before, when you guys were playing in the Pac-12 championship, knocking on the doorstep of the college football playoff. And I want to talk about the offense to start off here. And I want to talk about your guys' QB1, Miller Moss. This is a guy that I think a lot of people think that just because he has never really played that much and had the starting job anywhere, they think that he's maybe a 20-year-old kid that, maybe not a lot of people know about. But Miller Moss is in the same recruiting class as Caleb Williams. Obviously, he's a Southern California kid. Has wanted to be a USC kid his whole life, and now he's got the opportunity to be QB1. Can you kind of talk about Miller Moss, expectations for him year one, and kind of the other weapons that he's going to have at his disposal in this high-powered Lincoln Riley offense?
So, yeah, I mean, you hit on all the key points. He grew up wanting to be a Trojan. Anytime on social media, you can see him as a young, as a little kid wearing his USC jersey. His dream school was to come to USC, and he was able to achieve that dream. Now, you mentioned he was in the same recruiting class as Caleb Williams. At that time, Caleb Williams was an Oklahoma Sooner. Miller Moss, he was also with Jackson Dart. You had Keaton Slovis was in front of him. So he's just been biding his time. He's gotten some game experience during his time at USC, but his first start was in the Holiday Bowl against Louisville. And anybody who watched that game, you're thinking, all right, well, there's just another Heisman in waiting. He just went out there, 370 yards, 6 touchdowns. And he was doing it. Yes, he had Taj Washington still out there. But for the most part, he was doing it with, at the time, 4 freshman wide receivers. Those young men now are sophomores, and they're all really talented, and they're all really good. They all bring a different skill set. So you've got Zachariah Branch, which is, he was a freshman All-American. Human joystick. I mean, you want to put the ball in his hands when he's in open space. You got a couple of other guys on the outside in Deuce Robinson and Jacoby Lane. Deuce Robinson, 6'6", 220 pounds. He was considered the number 1 tight end in the 2023 recruiting class, but USC had visions of big wide receiver, and you kind of saw flashes of him last year doing that. Again, you're playing behind guys like Brendan Rice. So you look at the stats, you're saying, well, they didn't put up big numbers. They were biding their time. They were practicing with Miller Moss, getting those second team reps during practice all season long. And then you got Jacoby Lane, 6'4", 200 pounds, who's got a 48-inch vertical. He's got arms that when he puts them out, they just don't stop. They just keep going. He's the type of red zone weapon you want to use, but he's not afraid to go across the middle despite him being slight. He's not big, thick, but he'll make plays for you. And then you have a guy, Mekhi Lemon. And if you know who Amon-Ra St. Brown is, he's like 2.0 Amon-Ra St. Brown. He brings that type of skill set to the game. He can play inside, he can play outside. So Miller Moss has a lot of tools to work with. And where Miller doesn't have to try and emulate the style of play that Caleb Williams had, that's fine. He doesn't need to be anybody but Miller Moss. Use all those toys you have on the outside. Use the running game if Lincoln Riley decides to implement that more in 2024. And you've got an offense it's going to be just as productive as any Lincoln Riley offense he's had in the past. That even when he inherits a quarterback, he has this Midas touch. He figures out their strengths and how to use them. You can go to Jalen Hurts. When he got his time at Alabama, he really didn't come into his own until Lincoln Riley got his hands on him. So Miller Moss has a big opportunity ahead of him. He's learning from one of the best quarterback coaches in the country, a quarterback-friendly system. He's got the tools around him, and he's been patient. He's waited his turn.
With Miller Moss, too, I think a huge advantage that he has, and we kind of mentioned it at the beginning, that he has been a backup quarterback under Lincoln Riley for 3 years now. So it's not like he's like a lot of other quarterbacks like we saw today, recording this Saturday afternoon with DJU at Florida State, where he kind of at times, didn't seem like he was on the same page with his receivers a lot. Miller Moss has been in the same Lincoln Riley system for 3 years, so he's got a good grasp of the playbook versus I do think USC was kind of looking at Will Howard in the transfer portal. And then, the bowl game happened, and I think Lincoln was like, hey, I actually might have something pretty special here with Miller Moss. So I do think you guys are in capable hands with Miller Moss at the quarterback position. And even though, even last year when you guys struggled with 7-5, even if you look at the weird last year with Lincoln Riley at Oklahoma, he has always had a top 8 scoring offense every year he has been a head coach. So you're kind of just looking at the Big Ten and comparing yourself with other teams. There's just a chance in some of these games against Minnesota, can Minnesota keep up with you guys scoring wise? Same thing with Wisconsin or Rutgers, where those guys are more kind of ball control defensive teams. So I actually think the offense, and heading into the Big Ten, a lot of people might look at it hey, maybe there's a little bit of culture shock, playing all these different kind of styles of teams. But I actually think you guys are going to be pretty well positioned against some of these teams. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and that's really going to be interesting to see how this season plays out, because it's not just USC who brings that type of offense. You're bringing in UCLA, Washington, Oregon. You've got that West Coast, Pac-12 flavor, so to speak, where the offenses teams tend to be more prolific, I guess is a polite way of saying it. You always hear about the Big Ten defenses. They're great.
They move the ball down the field. They move the ball through the air.
Yeah, what happens when they get to the red zone? It turns into field goal games. So,
yeah,
statistically,
Iowa Hawkeyes.
Yeah, defenses look great. We're going to see, you have Ohio State that can put up points. You have Penn State that can put up points on occasion. Michigan last year was putting up points despite, running the ball 80% of the time. Mm-hmm. So it really comes down to, skiing. It's kind of like when you're watching a boxing match. Styles make fights. Can USC style impose its will against defense? And same thing. Can Oregon do the same thing to an Ohio State? It's those, I don't want to say clash of the titans, but you have different styles coming together, so to speak.
Yeah, I want to kind of switch and transition to the defense here, because I was kind of going back to conversations that all of us were having last year about USC, and coming off of the 10-2 season, Caleb Williams coming back off of a Heisman. I think we were looking at USC, some of the transfer portal additions that you guys made, and we're like, hey, this USC defense, this is going to be the year where they kind of put everything together under Lincoln Riley, and this USC team can be a national championship contender. Well, we were dead wrong, because that defense was absolutely abhorrent. they couldn't stop anybody. And then by the middle of the year, everything just kind of fell apart. And this year, USC and Lincoln Riley said, enough is enough. They move off of Alex Grinch.
Yeah.
They get D'Anton Lynn from the crosstown rival UCLA. You guys have a bunch of other really talented defensive coaches that you guys had coming in. You got a few defensive backs from UCLA too. You got a tackle leader from Oregon State. Kind of talk about the big key impact changes that have happened with this defense over the past year, because I don't think enough people are talking about it. And I think if you're looking at USC going up to that 8, 9, 10 win range, the defense being improved is going to be a big part of that.
Yeah. And the nice thing about it is, and I appreciate you being polite with USC's defense last year. We can call it for what it is. It was terrible. It was bad. It was crappy. So just the fact that, again, Lincoln Riley, he cut that umbilical cord, that, that safety net that he had with Alex Grinch, went out, got D'Anton Lynn from UCLA. He wasn't done there, though. I mean, Lincoln Riley, he said going forward that defense was going to be the number one priority when it comes to building USC. So he's now going to back those words up. He went out and got D'Anton Lynn. We'll get back to him in a second. But he wanted to improve his linebacking position. So he went and he convinced North Dakota State's head coach, who has a couple of national championships under his belt, do me a favor, come be my linebacker coach, assistant defensive coordinator, and let's help USC's defense get back to where it should be. Now, granted, Matt Entz wants to be a head coach at the FBS level, so these things work hand in hand. But Lincoln Riley was able to convince a head coach with national championships, subjugate yourself, come be a linebacker coach, learn what you need to do to recruit at this level. He then went out and got Eric Henderson, defensive line coach, LA Rams. He's been working with guys like Aaron Donald, Kobe Turner, who was last year's Rookie of the Year, I believe, and said, hey, we got a job for you over here. And then to improve the secondary, he went out and got Doug Belk, who is from Nick Saban's coaching tree. USC actually outbid Georgia for his services. So, yeah, total upgrade on the defensive side of the ball with the coaching staff. They kept one guy, Sean Nua, who was on last year's coaching staff. He's going to be co-defensive line coach with Eric Henderson. You mentioned what D'Anton Lynn did at UCLA. The nice thing about it is USC doesn't have to jump all the way up to a top 11 defense. They're going to have a top 10 offense. You combine a top 30 defense with a top 10 offense, that's usually a winning formula. That's a recipe for the 12-team playoffs, and that's where USC is. I've seen enough through practice so far. I've seen what they've done through the offseason as far as adding 1,400 pounds to the roster across, in the trenches, offensive line, defensive line, across the board. But this now looks like a USC team that, maybe your parents grew up with or your grandparents grew up with. They're no longer the small Trojans that you've seen for the last couple of years. So now you've got a new defensive philosophy. You've got more confidence. You've got the players that are talking about how confident they're playing. And again, I don't need to see top 11 defense, number 2 run defense in the country. Give me a top 15 run defense. Give me a top 30 overall defense. And I'm going to be sitting back like this at the end of the year, pretty happy.
Absolutely. And I saw that Nick Saban was even complimenting the coaching staff moves that USC made this offseason. So I think that's a good endorsement if Nick Saban is giving you as those kind of compliments. I do want to talk about – go ahead.
I was just saying, although he wasn't ready to take the next step and say USC is going to be in his 12th team. Playoff format.
Well, yeah, he couldn't bump out one of his 5 SEC schools.
No, you can't do that.
Oh, gosh. I do want to talk – Yeah, I do want to talk about Lincoln Riley here because there has been a lot of discourse about Lincoln Riley. I do think his move jumping from Oklahoma to USC has made him one of the college football's biggest villains and one of the most unliked characters, even though I still kind of find him a little bit favorable. Maybe it's because he's not in my life anymore, but all of the SEC hates him. Oklahoma has a big contingent where they're against him. The Pac-12 is against him because there's always like a thing where they're not, necessarily rooting for SEC. But I do want to talk about Lincoln Riley because last year, team goes 7-5, and everyone is kind of like panicking about Lincoln Riley, saying, "Oh my God, he's lost his touch. His defenses will never be good." And now everyone thinks that like Lincoln Riley is a bad coach, and I'm kind of like, well, he has one bad year. and we're gonna kind of like write off everything else that he has done, at Oklahoma and even that first year at USC.
Yeah.
So kind of where are all the Trojans fans sitting with Lincoln Riley? Because this could be a situation like Harbaugh at Michigan, where there's like a national outcry about like how he's not beating Ohio State, but then Michigan fans are like, "Hey, we're happy with Harbaugh. He's improved the team, and we'll hopefully get to that Ohio State issue like at some point, but we're working on it."
Yeah, I think a lot of USC fans, and deservedly, are kind of in a wait and see mode this year. It's like, all right, we've given you a couple years. Yeah, maybe you teased us too much in year one, brought a Heisman Trophy back to the camp, back to USC, pulled hamstring away from going to the college football playoffs. I People don't remember USC was dominating Utah in that playoff game, in the conference championship game, and then Caleb Williams pulled up lame with a pulled hamstring. Yeah,
Wasn't the regular season game a 2-point conversion too or something? My memory's right.
yes, and again, but that was on. Well, you don't want to point the finger at the defense, but yes, USC lost that game at the end of the game. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Part of that, though, is on Lincoln Riley. It's the hubris that I think sometimes he brings on himself by relying so much on the offense. So people knew at the end of year one, despite getting so close to the college football playoffs, something needed to change on the defensive side of the ball. And Lincoln Riley still wasn't ready to make that adjustment. He came out at a couple of days, a week after the loss to Tulane in the bowl game. And he said, I could just feel it in my gut. I can see it happening with Alex Grinch. I know he can get it done. Well, as you talked about earlier on the show, as the season kept going, the team had literally, especially on the defensive side of the ball, they had tuned Coach Grinch out. I mean, there was literally a moment during the game USC lost to Washington where it was during a timeout and the defense was huddled around Alex Grinch. And you know how you break a huddle, the coach will put their hand up and everyone will kind of join in. They left him hanging. They all went their all separate ways. And it was at the end of that game, he was let go of his duties. So keeping Alex Grinch last year was his downfall to the season. Because you had Caleb Williams coming back. You were returning most of your offensive line. You had the skill position players. You had the talent on the defensive side of the ball, but you weren't willing to change the scheme. You're trying to fit square pegs into a round hole. Instead of using the talent and designing the scheme around that, you're using the talent and trying to make Alex Grinch's scheme work. And it was like oil and water. They don't mix. And you saw the results on TV. USC's defense was a punchline.
Yeah, I think that is probably the biggest difference, as we were talking about earlier, with having D'Anton Lynn as your guys' DC now. Because basically, I was kind of reading some like previews, and they do the thing where it's like the anonymous coach weighs in, and a lot of people are saying just like, hey, just schematically with D'Anton Lynn, like everything's going to be better on that front, because it's not like USC has like no talent and just has like a bunch of 2-stars, like, kind of running around on the defensive side of the ball. Like, you guys do have some talent over there. You just kind of have to learn how to like use it.
Thank you for bringing it up. So the other day after practice, I asked Coach Lynn, I said, what's the difference between USC and UCLA? What's been the biggest difference that you've seen since you've come over here? He says, USC actually has more talent on their defense than I had at UCLA. And my jaw literally hit the floor because I'm thinking, well, where was that talent last year? It comes down to X's and O's. It comes down to scheme. We would sit there in the press box and we would watch that defense, shift right before the opponent snapped the ball. And the opponent knew it too. They said, here comes the shift. Once the shift happens, whichever direction USC went, the ball was going the opposite direction. I mean, that's how easy it was to read the defense. So yeah, Coach Lynn coming over, the players keep talking about it. They're just playing with confidence. Eric Gentry, who was, one of the starting linebackers last year, we asked him, hey, what's different about this year compared to last year? I'm learning how to play football. That was his answer. That's an indicting statement coming from a player talking about the previous staff. Without talking about the previous staff, that's all you need to know.
Yeah, those are very telling quotes if they're being that blatant about how big of a difference. It's kind of like the Tua thing, like that happened earlier this week, where Tua was like, yeah, like this coach actually likes me and he's telling me that I'm good. And the other coach told me I sucked every day. So sometimes kind of like how I believe a lot of coaches kind of have the saying, it's like they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. I think that's kind of juice is kind of starting to flow around USC right now. This is a very important question I wanted to ask you guys because one, when USC, UCLA joined the Big Ten, kind of everyone's kind of like jaws drop because they look at the fact that like the closest school to UCLA and USC before Oregon and Washington joined, obviously, was the Nebraska Cornhuskers, who were located on kind of the eastern half of Nebraska. So people kind of do in their heads, they're like, that's a lot of flying back and forth that UCLA and USC are going to have. I was reading this in a preview magazine, and I don't know if it's true because then after I read this, I saw on ESPN they had a different number, but USC is going to be flying somewhere between like 16,000 miles of travel this season and 18,000, somewhere in that range. How do you think that is going to affect USC, just kind of like the travel that is going back and forth, from road games?
It's an interesting question. I think everybody's wondering how that's going to play out. I'll say this: look, these guys aren't flying coach on Spirit Airlines. Let's just start there. They have their own plane.
Yeah.
Well, they charter their own plane. There's going to be plenty of room. They're not going to be, I don't think jet lag's going to play a part in this. Now, as far as the schedule is concerned, the last time they travel east is October 19th when they go to Maryland. After that, the last time the next time they truly go on the road is when they fly up to Washington. So I don't think it's going to play a significant role in things, especially early in the season. Obviously, October 19th, East Coast, I don't think weather is going to be an issue. So as far as the travel, it doesn't really matter. USC flies to Notre Dame every other year. They've traditionally, out of conference, they travel anyways. They played at Auburn. They played at Arkansas. They played at Virginia Tech, which was in Landover, Maryland, at Penn State. This isn't something new. USC is going to travel 5 times this year. Again, one of them's to UCLA, another one's to Washington, and then you've got Minnesota and Maryland, and the game in Michigan. So, yeah, I really don't think it's an issue.
I always thought it was funny when you guys joined the Big Ten and all the current Big Ten schools would be like, how is USC and UCLA going to deal with the snow? And I was like, well, they're probably never going to play in the snow. Like they always have the UCLA game towards the end of the year. You guys have the Notre Dame game at the end of the year. It's the schedule is going to be like different. Like I live in Big Ten country. There's very rarely snow games.
Thank you. And I always have my canned response for this. The Pac-12 is such a unique conference from the Pacific Northwest to the Southwest with the desert schools, used to be.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I remember in one year, USC will play in 110 degrees down there in Arizona. And then, 3 weeks later, you could be playing up in the Pacific Northwest in sleet, in, 35-degree weather, raining. So I don't know, maybe it's the Big Ten schools that have to adjust when they come out west in September. I don't know if they're going to be able, I don't know if they can condition themselves to a Labor Day type of weekend in LA when it's 110 degrees. It's different.
Does it really get that hot there? So like if Wisconsin's coming like
ask Purdue how hot it was in the Coliseum when they came back. I think it was when Drew Brees was their quarterback.
I'll have to text Drew Brees after this.
People were literally being taken out of the Coliseum on stretchers. And I'm talking about the USC band members. That's how hot it was.
Man, Big Ten's going to have to adjust to USC and UCLA. I like it.
I like it. And you said it. The weather, I think, it gets overplayed. Wind is the biggest issue in a football game. It's not rain. It's not snow. It's not even really the heat. It's the wind. That plays the biggest factor.
Absolutely. You listen to the gamblers. They say, hey, if it's super windy, bet the under.
There you go.
That's what the Sharks say. So, Mark, thank you very much for coming on. We're out of time here today. Do you want to tell us where we can find all of your work, and then we'll head out of here?
Sure. So, with the Locked On USC podcast 5 times a week, part of the Locked On Network. When I'm not there, you can also find me doing some written content at wearesc.com. So we do a show over there once a week called Inside the Trojan Huddle. You can find that on YouTube as well every Tuesday. So there you go. That's where I am. Busy guy.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, man.
Anytime. Let's do this.
Thank you for watching this episode of the Sports Detective Podcast Show. If you liked what you saw here today, please hit that like button. If you haven't done so already, please hit that subscribe button. That is the one thing that you can do to help support this show, and it costs you absolutely nothing, $0, and it is the best way to help the show grow and to help us defeat the algorithm. And if you also like what you saw here today, make sure you check out Mark Kolkin's work on all of the places that he said at the end of the interview, and make sure you check out more Sports Detective podcast videos. You might like them. Thanks for watching. Talk to you next time.